everyone, and welcome back to The Monthly Truth, the podcast by the PMDD Project, where we have open, honest, and empowering conversations about living with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by Heather Hendrie. Heather is a Canadian-based nature counsellor, writer, and co-author of the award-winning and best-selling book Awfully Hilarious Period Pieces. A powerful and unapologetically funny collection of stories about menstruation, told through a feminist and inclusive lens. She's also the founder of True Nature Wilderness Therapy, where she supports people through nature-based mental health work, something that I couldn't wait to learn more about. In today's episode, we'll be talking about periods, hormones, what it means to reconnect with ourselves through nature and creativity, and even share some hilarious stories along the way. I know you will just love Heather as much as I do by the end of this, so let's get into it. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather. It's so nice to finally meet you. I feel like we've been speaking to one another for a really long time now, and that's the beauty of the PMDD community. You can just connect with so many different people from different walks of life, but it's really nice to meet you all the way from Canada. So yeah, welcome.
Thanks, Phoebe. I'm so delighted to be here. I've been avidly following what the PMDD project is up to and so excited to see it growing and launching this podcast.
Oh, thank you. And you too. I've been watching you growing too, and it's amazing. So I always start off by asking my guests in just a few words, how would you describe PMDD?
I always describe the acronym because people don't necessarily know what it is. So I say premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And I often talk about it as a hormone-related cyclical mood disorder.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. I think there can be a lot of confusion and misconceptions around it as well. So I think that's the perfect way to describe it. Yeah. And so for anyone that doesn't know you yet, tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of what's led you to do the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, thanks so much. So there's all sorts of titles we could apply to myself. I work as a therapist. I identify as a writer. Um, I'm a woman living on the unceded land of the Lillooet and Squamish people in Whistler, British Columbia, Canada. And in my day job, I'm greatly privileged to walk alongside people moving through various challenges in their lives. And I also have a side passion project called the Awfully Hilarious Project, which involves writing and playfully provocative work around trying to change the harmful systems that are damaging us all. What I often say is the clients who come in to work with me are hurting for no fault of their own. Generally, it's around who they love in a society that's told them who they're supposed to love, or who they are in a society that's told them who they are supposed to be, or something they underneath, like in my case, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, undiagnosed for 30 years, causing so much challenge and pain in my life, but I just didn't know what it was. So that's a little snippet of who I am, which is evolving day by day.
Yeah, so interesting that you've been undiagnosed for 30 years, and that's such a long time. And but also in the grand scheme of things, from speaking to so many different people within the community, it's quite normal to go that long without not knowing, what it is. And it's interesting because you're based in Canada, and I can easily sit here and talk about sort of the reasons why PMDD is so under-recognized and misdiagnosed. But in Canada, what does it look like there? Like, how is PMDD understood or treated there? Do you think it's different from the UK or?
Well, and I get this sense, and I haven't spent a lot of time in the UK apart from some joyous visits to London. I really don't know the scope of the landscape there as relates to premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I'd love to hear that more from you. What my assumption is that things are quite far ahead in the UK and in Australia than they are in North America for a lot of reasons. When I first started to understand what premenstrual dysphoric disorder even is, I was first exposed to it in my counseling training in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. But at the time, I didn't make the connection that that's what I was struggling with because I was so disconnected from my menstrual cycle for all the reasons we can discuss here, stigma in society and patriarchal culture. But in Canada, when I was starting to try to uncover what was going on, I came across the amazing organization, the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders. And something I was really interested in, Phoebe, when we began talking even before recording, is that the PMDD project is largely volunteer-run project. IAPMD in Canada also, that these are not necessarily government branches. These are passionate people, many of whom have PMDD, trying to help other people who have PMDD and haven't received the support. But I am coming around to answering your question, is when I discovered our International Association of Premenstrual Disorders, they have a map of where practitioners are who might provide support or diagnostics. And I was living in British Columbia at the time, and there was nobody in my entire province here in Canada. And then when I looked across the country, there were maybe at the time two or three practitioners. So very, very few resources. In the end, I'm not ashamed to admit this, because I think these are the lengths you have to go to for help sometimes. But I had to lie to get in to see a psychiatrist based in Toronto, in Ontario, in order to finally get a diagnosis. And I speak English as a first language. I hold many layers of privilege. I'm the daughter of a doctor. And I had to lie at the age of 42. And I'm a healthcare practitioner myself as a clinical counselor. But I had to lie to get a diagnosis after 30 years of trying. So in short, the scene right now is not very good, but I'm seeing a real growing interest and attention. And since it seems that since the conversation around perimenopause and menopause has entered the sort of the more open dialogue and with social media, there is some more attention to premenstrual dysphoric disorder, particularly given that a huge number of people through perimenopause and menopause are starting to experience what might be, unfortunately, the monthly experience for a lifetime of somebody who has premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So the attention in that area, I think, is beginning to bring more attention also to sufferers of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, if that makes sense. But from where I sit, it looks like the movement's really being led in Australia and in the UK by the real courage of high profile people who have premenstrual dysphoric disorder and are speaking up about it. But I don't think we've been doing a good job of it in Canada at all. But that's
Yeah.
one person's take. That's my experience, and my real hope is our work can change that.
Yeah, 100%. And there definitely is hope. And it's really interesting to hear that, because it's, I speak to people all over the world because it's a global condition. And there are so many people that are trying to help others with PMDD, like yourself. And I think it's really interesting to hear the differences in sort of the levels of support and treatment and awareness in Canada compared to America or, the UK or Australia. I think I'd always say that Australia are probably, from my personal opinion, seem to be at the forefront of sort of leading that change. I think the UK have got an incredibly long way to go, but we are, by the sounds of it, more advanced than other areas. But there is hope. I think there definitely is hope. And you did mention like how that you kind of think maybe menopause is that blueprint for women's health conditions as a whole. And I think you bang on there. I think menopause in the UK definitely is a conversation that's been going on for quite some time. And yes, it's still an uncomfortable conversation. And yes, there's great lengths that we've got to go to. But they're leading the way, because now we're able to start having these kind of conversations around it. And yeah, I think there definitely is hope on a global basis. So fingers crossed it won't take too much longer anyway. But
I just want to respond to that too, is that the democratic countries worldwide, if we can lead the way, like if the UK, if we're saying that Canada's behind, the UK's behind, Australia's perhaps leading the way, I only think about like entire continents, Africa, India, other places where as we know, 1 in 20 menstruating people is dealing with this condition. There is a long way to go. And despite my disparaging comments about where we're at in North America, I think we're quite far ahead and have a lot of work and responsibility with this privilege to support others globally. That makes sense.
yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think you're so right. And I think it is a scary thought to think of, underdeveloped countries who people will be experiencing it too, and they're not getting the support at all. So yeah, there's an incredibly long way to go. And I think by everyone coming together, only good can come from it, hopefully.
Here, here.
Um, yeah, so how did your own menstrual or mental health journey shape your passion for the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, so one thing I really like to refer to from Taoism, the idea that what's in the way is the way, or in therapeutic language, we might speak of the idea, people speak all the time about PTSD and trauma, but what's not enough in the dialogue is post-traumatic growth and how after disaster has struck or after we've navigated something really difficult, how we might grow in new and different ways that we wouldn't have otherwise. And as a nature-based therapist, I'm often using the metaphor of what happens to a tree when it's blocked from the light in one direction, and it might grow in a really unique, beautiful new way that it didn't before. It widens its root system. The same is true for me when it comes to premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I struggled and suffered for 3 decades. And as I found wellness, I feel really, really lit up and inspired to help others. And I really know the terrain. I've walked the path. And so I feel both responsible and deeply privileged to be able to walk alongside others as they might find their way to wellness also. And for me, what happened was I've led a very privileged life. I had a really beautiful upbringing. I got my period when I was 14, which is late at the time. I was a competitive swimmer and very slight build. And then the wheels fell off. Within a couple weeks, I developed anorexia, which is highly comorbid with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, as we know now. We didn't know at the time. My parents did everything they could to help me, and we had no idea what was going on. We went to doctors, psychiatrists. Nobody knew. Tried different medications. But fast forward, I struggled on and on. I'd start to feel better and then worse again and better and worse again, better and worse again, which, as I know now, was tracking my menstrual cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know that at the time because I'm just going to say I was so divorced from my cycle. I tried to live my life as though I was a man, really. Because about the age of 6, I think, I just learned it was better to be a boy. And I don't mean any sort of, I don't mean that I wanted to be a boy, but I meant I wanted what the boys had, which was a particular freedom and to like the things I liked and to dress the way I liked to dress and to cut my hair the way I liked, which at the time gave me the label of being a tomboy. But if falling into that, I think this set me up for a lot of struggle when it came to my period because that was something that didn't track with my story. And so I just kind of wanted to operate like I didn't have it and hide it and ignore it and always operate as though it weren't happening. So I think that also played into it being such a long time before me recognizing that there it was in fact a pattern between my overwhelm, anxiety, depression, life distress, and the cycle itself, which of course those of us here likely know that PMDD is a physiological condition, but for years I just thought it was a personal failing that I was trying to heal through therapy. And unfortunately, despite really well-meaning practitioners I was working with, it was treated as such, something where like through cognitive behavior therapy or motivation or a better attitude I could get on top of, which as we know is not true. If um yeah, so yeah, I could go a long way into that, but I didn't really figure out what was going on until I really hit a deep low during the first year of COVID. And
Right.
I didn't have a job, I didn't have a house, I didn't have a partner. I was just sort of feeling like, is this all there is? Is this really what my life is going to look like? And it's too hard. And I'm really, really supported and grateful in that I reached out to my mom and she was there for me and she always has been. This is going to bring me to tears. She always has been. But she said, you know, she really supported me, but then she also said, I really think there's something hormonal at the base of this. Like a switch flipped when you got your first period. How about we work on this together? And I've just never felt more supported. And it was shortly thereafter that we really started digging into PMDD. She found the diagnostic criteria on the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders, and then I looked at it through that lens with her, and I got an A+. Every single criteria I matched, and then I began doing what we need to do to diagnose PMDD, tracking 2 months of the cycle. And sure enough, there was an absolutely clear pattern that had been missed, unfortunately, by all the practitioners I'd seen for the last 30 years because they weren't looking for it, because nobody ever asked about my menstrual experience. And now, as a therapist and practitioner, I very deliberately see my clients every 2 weeks. And as part of my screening, I always bring up some of the what we would consider the taboo topics in our first conversation. I ask about sex and sexuality. I ask about their cycle and how it is for them, such that there's space for it to come up throughout our time and our work together. And I think it was by not asking some of those questions that I got missed.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that because, I mean, I'm sure anyone watching and listening to this is going to resonate with with those words, and I think it's so heartbreaking to know that you have to get to that stage in order to get the help, and to, I suppose, really look inwards and see what is it that's causing this pain.
Hmm.
So thank you for sharing that. Um, and I wonder, how did you then? Because I know you said for years you sort of didn't want to be associated with your hormones and your cycle, and you didn't want that to have to not define you, but for that to take over sometimes. So how did you overcome that stigma, I suppose?
That's a daily project. I'm going to do some work on it right now
Right.
and let everyone know I'm on day 2 of my cycle, which for me, as someone with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, is like, it's kind of the
Yeah.
oasis. It's like I've got maybe, if I'm lucky, I might have 6 good days ahead. And I'm wearing this t-shirt
I
because
know. I
I want
love
to just
that.
grab those stigmatized subjects and poke at them in a playfully provocative way. And still, it's hard for me to do. It's hard for me to talk about. When I released the first book with the Awfully Hilarious Project, which we can go into more, it was about disasters in online dating. But a lot of other stories were submitted too. One that really struck me, it's called A Sock in a Dark Place from my friend Kaylee, about a bladder prolapse she experienced after having her child, and it went undiscovered for 6 months. She was walking along and thinking like a sock got caught in her pants in the laundry, and it was just sort of going down her leg. And that was just it's just such an
Wow.
egregious reminder that women's health gets overlooked, that it reminded me, okay, these books, and it was such a happy accident. It became a bestseller on Amazon. We've won the Canadian Book Club Awards 2 years running. I thought this is a way to have the
Wow.
conversation. And then I started thinking, what are some conversations I would really like to see being had? And it's really that one around women's health, and then in particular premenstrual dysphoric disorder and menstruation. So that's what gave birth to Awfully Hilarious period pieces. And the reason this fits in with your question, Phoebe, is when I launched the call for submissions, like, okay, we're going to do one on periods, and I reached out to my dear friend Ken Braithwaite, who's a designer, and I said, we want like a blood splatter on the front of the book. And he's like, okay, here we go. It was so edgy for me. I was so uncomfortable. I was like, okay, I'm going to post about bleeding and blood on my social media, which I've never even spoken about previously with a partner. Like, I kept it secret from my sisters and my parents. I just didn't ever want to talk about it. I felt so much shame around it. So a big part of this is that it's an edge for me too. But the more I do it, the more I talk about it, the more I realize this is a natural bodily function that happens to roughly 50% of the population, at least for about a week a month. It's something that really deserves a bit of airtime. So I had to get over myself. And in Canada, somewhat similar to the UK, there's unfortunately sometimes something that I really embodied, but I wouldn't say I've got a stiff upper lip, but the suffer in silence message somehow really got through to me somehow. Not through my
Mm.
family, but I just felt that that was what you're supposed to do. And to that point you made about pain, is when we're dealing with pain untreated, we try to come up with ways of soothing ourselves. And very often what that looks like is disordered eating, um, going to the bottle, alcohol, addiction. This is just untreated pain. And this is why we see so much of this comorbid with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's like we don't know what the source of the pain is. We're trying to take care of ourselves. Unfortunately, it ends up being in a maladaptive way, but it's really this attempt at self-soothing. And part of these books is around soothing one another and letting folks know that if this pain, that it's not for catharsis. It's not to say that, oh, I'm in so much pain. It's to say this awful thing has happened to me, and isn't it hilarious that it's happening to all of us, and it's this big secret and none of us are talking about it, and actually these were the really funny bits of it, and let's laugh for a second so that we can breathe, because laughing's about as helpful as crying, and we won't be tired of crying for a minute. So that's also kind of the idea for the title of the project and the series, is these really tough things that when we're alone in are so overwhelming and incapacitating. But when we recognize that we've got a whole community around us and we can link arms, that the outcomes can be very different.
Definitely. I think the title in itself, Awfully Hilarious, is just genius. And I think you're right, there is so much power in coming together and talking about it, and just going back to sort of your journey in being able to talk about it, and being okay with talking about it, and being okay with it affecting you. I think that's through to sort of that exposure therapy of like continuing to open up and just understand why you may be feeling the way you're feeling, and maybe understanding the root cause behind PMDD or the root cause behind your symptoms. And I think there is so much power in that in order to get the help that you need. And yeah, I think Awfully Hilarious. I mean, it sounds like such a genius concept because there is power in laughter, and there is power in sort of taking ownership of and taking control of a condition that you feel utterly out of control with. So tell us a little bit more, for anyone that isn't aware, just a little bit more about the books and maybe the process of gathering the stories that you do gather as
Yeah.
well.
I'm just giggling because just in terms of the power of humor, like there's so many things we might want to say in the world, but when I think about humor is so contagious. I just last week came across my new favorite comedian in the UK. Her name Victoria Eames did this hilarious thing that went viral where she's in yoga pants and she goes out and says, feeling anxious, depressed, got to get your minge on a tree, and she's straddling and wrapping around this tree, and I just thought that's amazing. And I just
So good.
what a great promotion for nature-based therapy and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Great conversation around consent and what about for those that don't have a minge. But I learned two things there: the word minge, amazing, and
Is that the first
humor.
time
And
you've
just
heard the word minge?
oh yeah, we're very unfamiliar with the word minge here in
Oh,
Canada.
minge is great.
It's a brand new. I wonder how many times we could say it here. But sorry, I lost the plot. I got caught up on minge on a tree. What were we talking about?
It's hilarious. Yeah, just tell us a little bit, I suppose, about. I'm thinking about minge now too. About the story behind the story
Oh
behind the
yeah,
book and like the
yeah,
process
so
of
they
gathering the
were not
stories.
originally called Awfully Hilarious. What happened was, oh, I spent this is a common story of people with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I spent many years bouncing from job to job and relationship to relationship because underlying my nervous system was so activated, and I couldn't. I was really really struggling to find stability. So this is one of the things that landed me in the position of far too many online dates, far too many disastrous online dates, and the one that happened several years ago, it's hilarious now, but at the time it was just beyond. So I matched with this person on an app called Hinge. He looks cute. He looks, like a reasonable person. We're going to go for a drink and get to know each other. And on my way there, I receive a message from him where he says, actually, how about we meet at this mountain instead? We'll hike this mountain. And I happen to live in the type of small mountain town where I was wearing yoga pants, gusseted yoga pants. I could do minge on a tree in those pants. But I was wearing something I could hike in. So I said, sure, we'll meet at the hike. And we get to the base of the hike and he leaps out of his truck, and it's the guy, even though he does not fit the description as he did on the app, which is unfortunately all too common, but we're starting already on a bit of a lie. And then
Yeah.
he's wearing this giant backpack, and I'm out immediately uncomfortable. I start thinking like, is he planning to sleep over on the mountain? Like what? Like it was not like a 40-liter pack with a snack in it. The thing was like what you would bring on a week-long epic on the West Coast Trail. So we introduce ourselves, and then I say like, dare I ask, like, what is in your backpack? You know? And he says, well, it's my wing, my parachute. I never hike the Chief without it. And then I'm really taken aback thinking he's hiking with a literal parachute on his back on our first date. And then I say, well, then I'm just get a bit playful with it. I'm like, so do you plan to use it? And he says, depending on the conditions. And I know what he means is, if the wind is right and the sun is right, I'm going to unfurl my parachute and like leap off the mountain and leave you there. But I get playful and I'm like, oh, you mean the conditions of the date? And he's like, no, the wind conditions, which that was the second time in 1 week that a man had planned his date with me around the wind conditions, which is
No,
highly
what?
problematic and tells you a lot about the Peter Pan atmosphere of the place I
Yeah. Yeah.
live. Anyway, it was a nightmare of a date, and I thought this is a new low where the person has literally arrived with his escape route on his back. As a therapist, I could say so much about the ultimate in avoidant attachment here, but I won't. What happened was I
Oh.
called a dear friend of mine on the way home crying. I was like, Paris, you won't believe what just happened. And she was so supportive, and she said, funny you should say that. I just got off a date, and the poor guy peed his pants on the date and then just ran off into the distance. And she said, we could write a book. And then I take things very literally. And next thing you know, I said, okay, let's do it. And we did. And it was originally just going to be this zine of these stories stapled together three of our best friends, me, Paris, and my friend Lindsay, we were going to staple together these stories and drop them in little free libraries and say, like, for anyone out there feeling alone while you're dating, you're not alone. Love the Tinderellas.
Oh, Tinderellas! That's so good.
But then as I started talking about this project, other friends of ours said, "Oh, I've got a horrible story. Can I put my story in?" And it just grew beyond the dating experience to something different. And then this is where I don't really feel it was not my idea. This came together with me and Lindsay and Paris, but then it was like the world wanted these stories because it just took off. It just took on its this energy of its own. I didn't even really think up the title Awfully Hilarious. I was just describing to someone it's those awful moments that become hilarious and then the title stuck. So it has really yeah, it's really grown of its own accord, if that makes sense. But it grew from a really like horrible experience that was also a bit funny. And it, you know, if it's not you that it's happening to, and
Yeah.
then the community and support of, in particular, my female friends around those tough moments. So we're actually working on the next one right now, which is called Awfully Hilarious Pillow Talk, launching probably early next year. And it's
Exciting.
sex, sexuality, desire, pleasure, intimacy, and suppressed stories on that subject, you know, the ones that we don't hear as often.
Yeah. I can't wait to read that as well because I think, do you know, I think even you explaining the dating stories, and I've got a few shockers, and I
Bring
think
'em.
just
Can't wait.
listening to, yeah, like too many to, oh, it's unbearable. But I think just listening to other people, I mean, I've never heard of someone bring a parachute to a first date, but I mean,
I
I
mean,
I love that. So it's just, I think there's probably so much like, I don't know, validation when you hear someone else's story and like, oh, someone else has gone through something pretty tragic as well, but we can laugh about it and I'm not the only one and it brings people together. I think I think it's genius. I really do. So
yeah,
I'm sure people listening to this will be dying to get their hands on the book as
it's
well.
it's just uh, it's just kind of a playful reframe around those really embarrassing or stigmatized things that happen that could make lead us to feeling really alone and separated, but
Yeah.
that could bring us together in really helpful system changing ways. And the difference is, I think, is talking about it and coming together in community versus feeling
Yeah.
so much shame and stigma around for good reasons. We've been told we're supposed to feel ashamed and about certain things. But what happens if we say, no, I refuse? I'm going to talk
Yeah.
about this thing because it needs some airtime. And if I'm suffering, there are at least several hundred, if not thousands or millions of others who are suffering with similar things.
Exactly. And I think you're right. There will be a lot of shame and, you know, people will go through something and it could break them because they might think this has happened to me and this is awful. This has happened because I deserved it. When actually, if you speak to other people, it might have happened to them, or they'll be able to sort of reassure you and say, look, I've had worse. Or just talking about it is just a therapy in
Right.
itself, isn't it? I suppose.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's amazing. Have you got any, I mean, I'm going to encourage anyone listening to this to buy the book, but have you got any submissions that particularly stuck with you?
Oh, they all do. I mean, one of the first submissions I received from somebody that I had never heard of or didn't know before came from an amazing writer in the UK, Becky Colley Hossel, and she was talking about her period poops and just the incident that happens in her story is beyond. And I was just peeing my pants, which is not hard to do at age 46 with pelvic floors that we're dealing with, you know, with the lack of attention to our pelvic floors. Luckily, that's receiving more attention these days too. But it's so funny. Like I don't want to blow the whole story because I think it's really worth a read and her writing is fantastic, but suffice to say she's in somebody else's house, her period is happening and the bowel movements that go with it and it's the toilet just can't handle it and so she luckily has some dog poo bags in her pocket and I will let you go from there. But it's
Okay.
really worth a read. So that one really stood out. And there's one, oh my gosh. I just had one submitted by a Canadian writer for the upcoming edition of Pillow Talk, and it's just the most amazing masturbation mishap that needs to be heard by the world.
I need to
This
hear
the
this.
sorts of things that ER physicians and nurses I think are very familiar with, but we don't perhaps get to hear quite enough of as lay people in the outside world. So yeah, shining some light on those moments that we might prefer to keep to ourselves, but there could be some wins in sharing them.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I can't wait to read that. Definitely. That's amazing. No, that sounds fab. I live with a nurse actually. One of my friends is a nurse, and you are right. The stories that they experience of people masturbating or having sex in some funny positions and using some incredible objects is just it's quite inspiring, to be
Giving
honest.
me an idea. I've got to chat with your roommate. Maybe we could do an awfully
Put you in
hilarious
touch.
medical moments.
I will put you in touch with her definitely. She's got a fair few
I'm
under the
writing it
belt
down.
already. So you're also a nature-based counsellor, and for what you've told me already, it just sounds so calming, so grounding, something that I definitely would love to tap into. But can you explain to the listeners what that actually involves?
Yeah, of course. And I've always been a really sensitive person from the time I was very young, and I've always felt best in nature. I'm very privileged to have grown up with a forest in our backyard, and that's where I spent most of my time. I was out there playing, and then my first jobs were always I worked at summer camps. I worked outdoors from the time I could have a job. And I always felt good in nature. I always just felt really most like myself in that space and away from the stimulation of, especially now, technology. Um, I just I just felt really able to be me. And felt really right. And I remember about 15 years ago, I was working in municipal government, involved with environmental behavior change, environmental activism. And I just remember I liked the work and did really well at it, but I felt that something was missing, a layer of meaning for me, that there was something else I could be doing. And I remember thinking, all I want to do is walk with people in the woods. I just knew that's where I felt best. And what I know now is that was a place where I felt my nervous system was really regulated and I was able to be most myself because I felt very safe there, which I know is not the case for everybody. Um, but as I progressed in my career, I learned of a program that where I could become a wilderness therapist. And I wasn't necessarily thinking of becoming a counselor at the time. I just thought, what an amazing program. The program involved spending 2 weeks in the canyons in Utah and a week on the Green River and learning about our bodies and our brains and how to support one another. And when I began, I realized, oh, I really have an interest and aptitude in counseling. So I graduated shortly before COVID started and began offering walk and talk nature-based sessions for clients. And there was real excitement around it. And the other thing that I really noticed is it worked. It worked. I wish such a thing had existed for me. But for a lot of people, it's very hard to sit in an office and spill their guts, and eye contact might be difficult. But when you're walking and talking, not only is it a more comfortable environment for some people, I also like to think that it decolonizes the therapeutic practice in a way in that it more closely parallels a walk with a friend. And of course, as a therapist, you're not a friend. There's a boundary you're maintaining, but it looks like something you might do in real life. You
Yeah.
might bump into other people, which of course, for some people that brings up concerns around confidentiality, but also there's also a way in which it's more real. It's more out in the world. It's the way we might have supported one another historically. And brain research shows that as we're engaging in bilateral movement or stimulation, we're also engaging both hemispheres of the brain, which is allowing us to potentially process experience differently. And of course, there's so much good research out there, but we don't need the research. I mean, the research does help for a lot of reasons, supporting funding, as you know, as a fundraiser in your day job. But we know that for the most part, we feel better if we go out and sit on a park bench over lunch or go for a walk in nature. But the research is coming in to prove beyond beyond any beyond any doubt that it is very helpful for us, and that of course we are nature. So it's always been a place for me that has felt very soothing and very calming, and for the clients I work with, it's a really, really beautiful opportunity. I don't speak of myself there as the therapist, more as the guide, and nature is the therapeutic element where relationship to the sun and the earth and the trees is that reminder that we are of this place, that we're not separate, that idea of dominance and dualism that we've been living under for many, many years in our capitalist patriarchal societies is not in fact true. That we are of this place. And I shouldn't say that. There are many cultures that still know that. But for many of us, it's a process of constantly having to remember that we are nature and we are a small part of a much larger fabric of life. And those experiences of awe or interruption when a squirrel makes a noise or a bird is singing can remind us of that. And the research shows hearing birds sing supports the vagal nerve and reminds us that there is potentially safety in that moment, that there are not predators present. So there are a lot of elements in the natural environment that are always conspiring to make us well.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I'm sold. But I think you're right because, I mean, just getting, those days with PMDD when you just can't get out of bed and like just getting changed and changing your bed or making your bed is is a task in itself. But actually, when you get outside for even 5 minutes or you just sit outside and, outside the front door, it makes the world of difference just breathing in the fresh air. And I love what you say about that you're the guide and nature is the therapist because I think nature is therapy and we are nature. You are right. I think I always think back to that when I go into full hibernation mode in winter and it gets dark and the days are really short and I feel rubbish and I don't feel like socializing and more often than not my PMDD intensifies. And I always beat myself up for not being able to do things and I actually need to remind myself that no, nature is hibernating right now and so can I. That's okay. We are, we have to act the same as nature because we all come from the same place. And I think
Yeah.
you touching on that is really beautiful.
Maybe, something that you just said really, I have more questions than answers about PMDD, of course. I think most of us still do because we
Yeah.
haven't. But as you speak about that light and natural light, I just wanted to name that and speak about that because that's another element of being outdoors. And for me, so many of those days, I know where I can't even respond to a text. I can't make myself breakfast. I'm gonna cry, but what I have always been able to do is to get out the door. And what I often do is just like lie on the ground and cry under a tree and to be held and supported in that way. But then the healing that is coming from that, like my eyes are receiving natural light. The tree is providing unbelievable support. The oxygen the tree is making, the carbon dioxide, the reciprocal relationship there. But the reason I wanted to speak about light is I have more research questions than I have answers for, and I'm not a researcher, but when you spoke to that about light and the winter time, I also live in a very dark place of the world in the northern hemisphere. It makes me wonder about the prevalence of PMDD in the southern hemisphere, along the equator. There's so much overlap with light exposure and PMDD. I got this like hilarious light visor I've been using that helps quite a bit. It's the same as these great light boxes, but I just can brush my teeth while I'm wearing it. And it's made a real difference. And so I'm saying that because I think over time we'll also learn, and my hope is that we'll learn more about that, but that interplay of light and PMDD, as well as sensitivity to our environments. Like, I don't see PMDD in people without a high degree of sensitivity. And yeah, if nature's hibernating all around us, why would we still be working a 40-hour week? There's a dissonance there, a lack of integrity, a lack of coherence, which my belief is that those of us with a really heightened sensitivity, the canaries in the coal mine, would feel that they'd feel something a bit wrong about that. So I really hear and honor your experience, and in the people that I work with PMDD, I see that across the board, that spring rolls around and people are feeling a lot better. So there's that overlap also with, we could diagnose it, seasonal affective disorder, and or is it something else happening in the brain? Is something else happening and it's an out of sync experience with the environment? To
Yeah.
me, again, I don't know. These are questions.
Yeah, but really valid questions. And I think being able to unpack that would solve so many problems and just being able to recognize sort of, those 40-hour weeks that we're currently used to. Does that need to change? And adapting to the different seasons as nature does, I think would make a huge difference to our symptoms. I mean, it certainly does. It makes an impact on my symptoms. And I think that's where the importance of your line of work comes into play as well. That connection to nature. How do nature-based practices, do you think, support people with PMDD or with anxiety, with trauma? Because they are all really
Yeah. Yeah.
interconnected, aren't they? So how do you think
Yeah,
it supports
absolutely.
them?
And anxiety, trauma, it's so many things come back to the root of a really of like, what's happened with us in our life experience, but then as a result, what then happens with the nervous system and the nervous system being harder to regulate, like maybe the nervous system's already hard to regulate, and then we would find ourselves in an active state, or things have occurred in our lives that have us in an activated nervous system state. Nature immersion is shown across the board to be very, very soothing and supportive of nervous system regulation for many, many reasons. The color green, seeing fractals, like that idea of repeating patterns in nature, straight lines, the color red, these are not things that are soothing to our nervous system. Beeping sounds, flashing sounds, which are ever present in our built environment, Nature is not like that. We don't experience that in nature. And in fact, a flat line in nature, a flat line on an EKG, that's very dangerous. A flat line in nature indicates a waterfall, a drop off, or a cliff. That signifies danger or potential death. The color red would signify nourishment or a berry. So we're really tuned in and looking at that. But when we look around our built environments, we're creating far too much there's far too much stimulation. So just the support of the spaces is really, really huge. And there's lots of good work being done around this, around environmental psychology and design. Um, but there's also the idea of attachment. And for many people, if we've been harmed in human relationships, it's very, very hard to feel safe in human relationships. We might feel comfortable in relationship with a pet, which falls under the large umbrella of nature-based therapies. We might feel really safe in relationship with having our back to a tree. And we can therefore start to build secure attachment and connection and relationship, because it is relationship. We're all related. And this idea of animacy too, to an animate universe where it's not just about the anthropocentric view that most of us operate under. I could go off on this for a long time, but
So
um,
interesting.
so there's the fundamental pieces around the research, and then there are also so many experiences of awe available in nature, which awe is an experience that can bring us up to what they would call the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that experience of increased perspective and curiosity and joy and beauty, which is fundamentally very, very supportive to our nervous system, to our experience of being alive and human, and supporting us in thriving, not simply surviving. But I also live in a place where I feel unbelievably privileged to have access to nature. And it's interesting, in my past work, before really understanding I had premenstrual disorder, before becoming a counselor, was around nature protection and fighting for wild places. And it seems that at the time I felt really frustrated that actions weren't being taken, the behavior changes weren't being made. And then I realized, if we're not well, we can't take these actions. We can't connect with one another. We can't support and protect and honor these places. But if we're in relationship, things are different. If we're in relationship, we work through the hard stuff. If we're in relationship, we protect these places that are their own beings and that have a right to exist. So that's what kind of led me more into my counseling work. I have a real interest in social justice work too, and that all plays into the work around Awfully Hilarious. But my initial work, all through my 20s and 30s, was environmental activism, environmental behavior change, and I'm still very passionate about that and connected to that. But I think my work in the world around that is around what Joanna Macy, one of my heroes, would call the work around shift in consciousness, about naming and starting to unpack the systems we live under as a whole in this world right now, and the dominant structures and how they might be actually at the root, the mechanism of injury that's causing domination of nature, domination of one another. None of the people who come in to see me are at fault for the pain they're experiencing. None of them. And I also don't want to blame the systems, but there is a mechanism of injury present that we could work together to address if only we start to talk about it, understand it, and shift our way of understanding the world and come back to relationship.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I feel like, so is this something then that I can imagine through nature therapy? There's many different kind of stories and experiences that you get then, and it's sort of understanding how best to support that person based on what they've presented you with. And just from what you've unpacked there, it sounds like, yeah, it's incredibly interesting. How best could people find you to get
Yeah.
that level of support?
Yeah, of course. My practice is called True Nature Wilderness Therapy. I've got a team of great people working in BC, but we don't just do walk and talk. We incorporate nature into everything we do. So we meet by video, we meet by phone. Um, yeah, it's truenaturewilderness.therapy.com, True Nature Wilderness Therapy on Instagram. We love to hear what other folks are up to. I know a lot of folks in the UK are doing great work around nature-based therapeutic work, more forest bathing. This is really taken off since COVID, when it became unsafe to be in close proximity to
Mhm.
people indoors. So I think there's been a real return to nature, and I feel very guided by nature and the natural world. So I think that's sort of the larger frame under which I operate as a whole, is reciprocal relationship. And when you speak to, depending what people are working through, if someone's going through a really hard time, I'll often choose to walk with them through an area where there's been a clear cut has happened. And we get to talk about this area has been damaged. There's been destruction here. There's been something has been taken here, and there is regrowth and there is resilience, and that work is happening. I believe there's a reciprocity with the witnessing and support of the natural space and of the person, and it's rich with metaphor, but that we're not necessarily just going out to pristine places. Nature is right in our home. We're surrounded by plants. I see plants right there behind you, and what that does for us. So yeah, thanks
Wow.
for asking. I feel deeply privileged and passionate about this work I get to do, and I get to do it because I'm well, and I've learned that I have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and I've learned how to treat it, and I've done that because I've had a lot of support, and I am hopeful about the next generation of menstruating folks that, after their first 2 or 3 cycles, if they're experiencing something, they're going to get the help they need and not have to wait on which, it's on average 9 years. It's certainly not 30 years.
Wow, but it's just really interesting to hear about the psychology behind it as well, because I think we all take for granted our connection to nature. I don't think we actually have the time to think about it deeply and understand it on a psychological level. So just
Mhm.
hearing that is really interesting. And when I think about how it can support me and my PMDD, you mentioned before how, you know, about the colours and the flat lines and being outside in nature just removes all of that constant noise that we get, I suppose, from our day-to-day jobs or just day-to-day life. And I think that's so interesting because I think with PMDD, a common symptom is heightened sensitivity
Yes,
to senses. So heightened sensitivity to noise, to sound. I think there's something really important in that because you don't
yes,
have that when you go into nature. You
yes,
hear the squirrels, you hear the birds, you
yes,
you hear nothing at times, and you
yes,
just feel you're able to hear your thoughts and focus on your thoughts and that.
yes.
And I
I,
think that's
I,
so
I just
powerful.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm jumping in because I'm so excited and passionate about this. But Phoebe, yes, what you just said, sensitivity, and I write about this in my story here, and I'm writing a book about my experience with PMDD also and my path to healing. But in here, I've written a story called Finger Painting, where it's not the first time this metaphor has been used, but I'm really likening folks with PMDD to the canaries in the coal mine. And the canaries were in the coal mine to keep people alive and well, and that sensitivity is a gift. That sensitivity is a gift. We don't want to wait for the canaries to die. We want to listen to them and bring them out of the coal mine and free them from the cage and say thank you so much. But that sensitivity that you're speaking of, yeah, we have a skill and magic superpowers in nature to pick up on what's going on in the environment. It's just that there's too much going on in our environments now. And that old way, the Victorian way of dominance over nature, parallels the dominance over our bodies, the dominance over menstruating bodies, the patriarchal systems. If we can come back to really healthy relationships that are belonging with rather than dominance over, it also shifts our relationship to our period, to our cycles, which are about life. Without a menstrual cycle, there would be no human life on earth.
Mm.
So coming back to the roots of that, and that I believe that those of us with PMDD, which again, another research question, because I think is very closely linked with neurodivergence, but that those of us neurodivergent with PMDD, highly sensitive, have a role to play as the canaries in the coal mine. And I don't want them dying in the mines. And that's
No,
why I do
definitely
what I do.
not. Yeah, and that's beautiful because I think people can see PMDD as this massive struggle, but it's also a superpower. Having that level of empathy and sensitivity and emotion is there's something really beautiful in that. And I suppose it's shifting that narrative and helping people who are in a time of crisis, because let's not beat around the bush, PMDD is it's awful. But I think being able to allow people to find some beauty in that and maybe help them recognize that there's nothing wrong with them feeling this level of emotion or being sensitive. It's finding ways around that or
Yes.
finding ways to nurture their sensitivity, I suppose. So that's
Yeah.
beautiful.
And I don't want to beat around the bush either. It's dangerous. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, eating disorders, which are highly linked, are the most fatal diagnoses in the DSM as far as I'm aware right now. And we are sensitive, and there's a difference between being sensitive and aware and raw and so unwell that you feel that you're walking through the world without skin, which I know that experience. I know those of you listening likely know that experience. And that's where we need support and treatment such that we can be in that space of how we are naturally sensitive we are, not in trauma response, but naturally sensitive and paying attention and then
Mhm.
acting on and have the wellness and the agency to act on what we see, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense, and I just think, and I hope that people are coming away from listening to this like I am, which is just feeling empowered and like there is hope and I don't know, there's such importance in the work that you do. So yeah, just thank you so much.
Well, and Phoebe, I'm just so grateful for the work that you're doing and over at the PMDD project, and to just learn that, those of you at the PMDD project are doing this work in addition to your paid day jobs because you're passionate and care and want to help others and to reach out a hand. That means so much to me. And I've seen that across the board in the PMDD community, that good people who have
Yeah.
suffered, who are wanting to help other people.
Yeah, it does seem to be across the board, doesn't it? And the same applies to you as well. I think a lot of this is fueled by passion, but it's because we care and we know that
Yeah.
there needs to be change.
Yeah.
I also kind of lastly want to pick your brains about creativity. You're obviously a very creative person and you've got many different passion projects that you're juggling. Um, and so from writing to therapy, it seems to play creativity seems to play a big part in your life. Do you see a connection then between creativity and healing?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm laughing because I'm like my latest creative projects. I'm like, hoo-hoo! I just made my little suitcase that says emotional baggage. I'm just gonna get creative.
Love.
I'm gonna play with all of this. But I think there's a close link between creativity, sensitivity, and healing, and also harm, because the creative, sensitive ones, the sensitives over the years have been harmed. I mean, I
Mm,
wouldn't be surprised. We can't prove this now. I don't think, but if Virginia Woolf and those beautiful menstruating magic creatives over the years also had PMDD, would not
yeah.
be surprised. But as far as where the healing lies, creativity is one of the spaces I think where we get to play with and explore post-traumatic growth, a way of fully self-expressing and coming into who we are, and that we know that great beauty and transformation comes through art. And I know you know this from your day work too, that art matters, and art and creativity can support us in thinking in big, broad, different ways. And I I I'm just going to quote Martin Luther King, but he had a dream that's creative. He created something. He believed and dreamed of something that did not exist. I'll lean on the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, the beautiful work of Trisha Hersey and the Nap Ministry. Beautiful people holding many layers of oppression over the years, who have dreamed of something different, of something better. That's creative. And Trisha Hersey of the Nap Ministry would say, you need space to rest and to be creative. You need to be able to sleep so as to dream, to give yourself that break and that rest, that that creative thought can emerge and you can dream and hope for something different and for something better. And
Wow.
we deserve that, as do the people around us. A world
Yeah, we
that
do.
is supportive of life, which we aren't machines. We don't, the capitalist colonial structures have had their time. We've got somewhere else to go
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and again, it's all about that hope. I think this whole episode is all about hope, actually, and you're really fulfilling that. So, but I think actually you're so right. I keep seeing this trend on TikTok and Instagram where people are videoing themselves out in nature or creating art or just existing, being, enjoying the fruits of their labor and not working. And they put this, I forgot that this was the point. And I think that's so powerful because I think we get so invested in our day-to-day work and just, the little things that really don't matter, that we forget the point is to just enjoy the world and like the incredible opportunities that come with that, whether that be the simple things of just getting outside or finding yourself in creativity and finding new hobbies. And I think I think if we had more time to focus on that, there'd be far fewer problems, I think.
I am with you. I think that's a conversation in itself. But you're right. And when we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, creativity, humor, play, awe, it's all at the top of the pyramid. That's where we're most alive and human and thriving. And that space, being most like ourselves in that space of thriving, inherently helps heal us and those around us. I love the work you do. I love that question. And I think it's no surprise that, yeah, I just think it's no surprise that you asked that, but that plays into the whole bigger picture. And I think a lot of
Yeah,
people with PMDD would probably identify as creatives, as writers, as poets, as singers. It's about
definitely.
using that voice, expressing that.
100%, definitely. And so I suppose, I mean, we've covered lots of different topics here, which has just been incredible. But I suppose my last question, I don't want this conversation to end, but if someone was listening today who is newly diagnosed or struggling, what would you want them to hear?
I it's funny, I play a lot with the language around hope with my clients, and I say like sometimes faith may be more helpful than hope is to believe that there's a better day or that tomorrow will be different than today. But I actually want to quote a beautiful, courageous woman I heard speak in an AA meeting. And she just stood up and her voice was shaking. And I might shake as I say this, but she said, Hope, hold on, pain ends.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, that's incredible. And just being in a room full of people and hearing that, I can imagine has had a massive impact. And it's so important to remind yourself of that as well when you have times of feeling like it doesn't end. So I think that's a really beautiful way to finish this actually, is to keep going. And I think you do feel lost, you do feel like you're in the dark and then it's not going to get better, but you don't know if next week you might find a new hobby. You don't know if next week you might find the new love of your life, a new friend, just something to laugh at, just a reason to get out of bed. And there is hope. Pain doesn't last
Yeah,
forever. And I think that's a
it
really,
is.
yeah, a really
And like
nice
if anyone out
message.
there wants to read these stories and can't afford it, hit me up, email me, so I can send it over, or you can ask for it in your library. I just asked for period stories. Half of the contributors here have premenstrual dysphoric disorder.
Wow.
It's prevalent. You're not alone, and there are supports available. But that I'm gonna repeat what she said. Hold on, pain ends.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. And yeah, I'll make sure to share links, sorry, with this episode of all of the incredible work that you're doing. But I just want to say a huge thank you. And I'm sure everyone's coming away from this just feeling uplifted, inspired, and just warmer. From having listened to your stories. So just thank you for the amazing work that you do. It's such a pleasure to speak to you and to know you. Yeah, thank you for everything.
Thanks, Phoebe. It's such an honor.